"If you dance to this song, I'll marry you," challenged the millionaire mother, and the waiter stunned the ballroom. Get ready for one of the most incredible stories you'll ever witness, a tale that will show you how talent, dignity, and authenticity can triumph over wealth and prejudice in the most unexpected ways. Today, we're diving into a story that proves sometimes the most extraordinary moments happen when we least expect them, and that true worth has nothing to do with bank accounts or social status. If this story moves you like I know it will, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss amazing stories like this one. Trust me, what you're about to see will remind you that magic can happen anywhere, anytime. Let's begin. The December snow fell gently outside the towering windows of the Grand Ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, creating a magical winter wonderland that seemed to transform Manhattan into a scene from a fairy tale. Inside the opulent space, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the pristine marble floor, as New York's most elite and powerful individuals gathered for what was being heralded as the social event of the decade. The annual Winter Charity Gala for the Metropolitan Arts Foundation had always attracted the city's most prominent families, but this year's celebration was particularly special. It marked the foundation's 50th anniversary and promised to raise over $20 million for arts education and cultural preservation programs throughout the city. The ballroom itself was a masterpiece of architectural grandeur, its vaulted ceilings adorned with hand-painted frescoes that had been commissioned from Italian Renaissance masters over a century ago. Massive Corinthian columns supported the ornate ceiling, while priceless Persian rugs covered portions of the marble floor in rich burgundies and deep gold tones. Tonight, the space had been transformed into a winter palace, with towering arrangements of white roses, silver branches, and cascading orchids that had been flown in from Thailand specifically for the occasion. Ice sculptures created by world-renowned artists dotted the room, their crystalline forms catching the light and throwing rainbow prisms across the walls and ceiling. The guest list read like a who's who of American power and influence. Tech moguls whose innovations had revolutionized entire industries mingled with old money families whose ancestors had built railroads and steel empires during the Gilded Age. Hollywood celebrities who commanded millions per film chatted amiably with Supreme Court justices, while foreign ambassadors shared champagne with Pulitzer Prize-winning authors and Nobel laureates. The minimum donation required to attend was $100,000 per person, ensuring that only the truly wealthy and influential could afford to be part of this exclusive gathering. Among the glittering crowd of luminaries, one woman commanded attention and deference wherever she went, her very presence seeming to create a gravitational field that drew others into her orbit. Victoria Elizabeth Ashworth Hamilton stood near the grand piano at the center of the ballroom, a vision of timeless elegance and unconscious authority that had made her the undisputed queen of New York society for over 3 decades. At 54, she possessed the kind of refined beauty that could only come from generations of careful breeding, excellent nutrition, and the finest health care that unlimited wealth could provide. Victoria's gown was a custom creation by Valentino himself, a masterpiece of midnight blue silk that had required over 300 hours of hand-beading by the most skilled artisans in Milan. The dress fit her tall, statuesque frame with the precision that only came from multiple personal fittings, with the designer, every seam and curve tailored specifically to her body. Her jewelry collection for the evening included a diamond and sapphire necklace that had once belonged to Russian royalty, matching earrings that had been gifts from various European nobles over the years, and a bracelet containing stones that were worth more than most people's houses, but which she wore with the casual indifference of someone for whom such luxury was as natural as breathing. Her silver hair, which had begun turning prematurely white when she was in her 30s, was now styled in an elaborate updo that had taken her personal hairdresser 6 hours to create. Each strand was perfectly positioned, secured with diamond-encrusted pins that caught the light with every movement of her head. Her makeup was applied with the kind of artistry that made her look simultaneously ageless and timelessly sophisticated, the work of a team of cosmetic specialists who had flown in from Paris specifically to prepare her for this evening. The Ashworth Hamilton fortune was legendary, even by Manhattan standards, representing the accumulated wealth of 7 generations of astute investors, successful entrepreneurs, and strategic marriages. Victoria's great-great-great-grandfather had made the family's initial fortune in shipping and textiles during the Industrial Revolution, investments that had grown exponentially over the generations through careful management, strategic diversification, and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate market trends and economic shifts. The family now controlled assets worth an estimated $18 billion, with interests spanning technology, pharmaceuticals, real estate, entertainment, renewable energy, and space exploration. Victoria herself was far more than just an heiress living off inherited wealth. She held advanced degrees in art history from Yale and international business from Wharton, spoke 6 languages fluently, and had spent the first decade of her adult life working in various family businesses to understand every aspect of their operations. She sat on the boards of 15 major corporations, chaired 8 prominent charitable foundations, and owned homes on 5 continents that had been featured in dozens of luxury lifestyle magazines. Her art collection, housed primarily in a private museum she had built adjacent to her Fifth Avenue mansion, included works by Picasso, Monet, Van Gogh, and numerous contemporary artists whose careers she had helped launch through her patronage. But Victoria's true power came not from her wealth, impressive as it was, but from her position as the ultimate arbiter of taste, culture, and social acceptability among America's elite. For over 30 years, she had been the woman whose approval could launch careers and whose disapproval could end them, whose dinner parties brought together the most influential people in business, politics, and culture, and whose opinions on everything from art to architecture to social causes were quoted in newspapers and magazines around the world. She had the ear of presidents and prime ministers, counted royalty among her personal friends, and could single-handedly make or break cultural institutions through her support or lack thereof. Tonight's gala was particularly important to Victoria because it represented the culmination of 2 years of intensive planning and preparation. As the founding chairwoman of the Metropolitan Arts Foundation's board of directors, she had personally overseen every detail of the evening, from the selection of the 7-course menu prepared by 3 Michelin-starred chefs to the choice of entertainment that would showcase both classical excellence and contemporary innovation. She had curated the guest list with the precision of a museum curator, ensuring the perfect balance of old money and new money, cultural luminaries and political power brokers, international celebrities and local philanthropists. The evening's entertainment program had been designed to reflect Victoria's sophisticated understanding of both classical traditions and modern artistic expression. The schedule included performances by rising stars from Juilliard and the American Ballet Theatre, established artists who had been supported by foundation grants over the past 5 decades, and a special multimedia presentation featuring excerpts from Broadway shows, opera productions, and dance performances that the foundation had helped fund. But the centerpiece of the evening was to be an elaborate tribute to the golden age of ballroom dancing, featuring world-renowned dancers from London, Paris, Vienna, and Buenos Aires performing the classical waltzes, foxtrots, and tangos that had defined elegant society for generations. As the cocktail reception reached its peak, Victoria found herself surrounded by the usual collection of admirers, supplicants, and social climbers who invariably gravitated toward her magnetic presence. The group included Jonathan Pemberton IV, heir to a pharmaceutical empire and one of the city's most persistently eligible bachelors, despite being 49 and having been divorced 3 times. There was Senator Patricia Morrison Chen, whose political career had been funded largely by contributions from Victoria's social circle, and who never made a major policy decision without consulting the city's most powerful philanthropist. Also present was Maximilian von Habsburg-Lorraine, a minor European nobleman whose title was authentic but whose personal fortune was largely theoretical, making him dependent on the generosity and social connections of American heiresses who enjoyed the prestige of associating with genuine aristocracy. Elena Rodriguez Nakamura, a tech entrepreneur whose artificial intelligence empire had made her one of the youngest female billionaires in history, stood nearby, still considered new money by established society, despite her enormous wealth, and therefore subject to Victoria's approval for full social acceptance. Dr. James Wellington Smith, Victoria's second cousin and one of the world's leading neurosurgeons, shared amusing anecdotes from his recent medical missions to developing countries, while Margaret Foxworth Pemberton, heiress to a mining fortune and Victoria's closest female friend, offered her opinions on the evening's entertainment and the various social dynamics playing out among their fellow guests. The conversation had turned, as it often did in Victoria's presence, to the perceived decline of standards and cultural refinement in contemporary society. "It's absolutely appalling what passes for culture these days," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying the kind of natural authority that made others automatically defer to her opinions and observations. "Young people today have no appreciation for the classical arts, no understanding of proper etiquette or social graces, no sense of what it means to conduct oneself with dignity, refinement, and genuine sophistication." Jonathan nodded emphatically, eager to align himself with Victoria's views and demonstrate his own cultural sensitivity. "You're absolutely right, Victoria. I attended a wedding in the Hamptons last month where the couple performed what they called a choreographed dance routine set to pop music instead of having a proper first waltz. It was embarrassing to witness, frankly. The guests didn't know where to look." Senator Morrison Chen, who had built her political career partly on her ability to read and reflect the opinions of her wealthy constituents, added her own perspective to the discussion. "The fundamental problem is that we've democratized culture and artistic expression to the point where excellence and genuine refinement are dismissed as elitist or exclusionary. Everyone believes their opinion is as valid as that of people who have spent decades studying and cultivating sophisticated taste." Maximilian, whose European accent lent an air of old-world sophistication to his observations, contributed his own continental perspective. "In Europe, particularly in Austria and Germany, we still maintain certain standards of cultural behavior and artistic appreciation that seem to be disappearing here in America. The pursuit of wealth has somehow replaced the cultivation of genuine refinement and spiritual depth." Dr. Wellington Smith, whose medical training had given him a scientific perspective on human behavior, offered his analysis. "I think part of the problem is neurological. Modern technology, particularly social media and instant gratification culture, has actually rewired young people's brains to prefer superficial stimulation over the deeper, more complex rewards that come from appreciating classical art forms." Elena, who was still new enough to this rarefied social circle to feel the need to prove herself worthy of inclusion among such distinguished company, spoke up hesitantly. "I've been trying to learn classical dance forms myself, ballroom, ballet, even some Latin styles. I think there's something profoundly beautiful about the tradition, discipline, and emotional depth that these art forms require." Victoria smiled at Elena with the kind of benevolent condescension she reserved for those who were making genuine efforts to better themselves culturally. How wonderfully admirable, my dear. Though, of course, true appreciation for classical dance requires much more than simply learning the technical steps and choreographic patterns. It demands understanding the historical context, the cultural significance, the emotional depth and artistic philosophy that separates mere physical movement from genuine artistic expression and spiritual communication. Margaret Foxworth Pemberton, who had known Victoria since their boarding school days and understood her friend's passionate dedication to cultural excellence, added her own observation. What Victoria means is that anyone can memorize choreography and execute movements with technical competence, but authentic artistic expression requires opening one's soul to the music and allowing genuine emotion to flow through every gesture and step. Bitage, as if the universe had been listening to their discussion about dance, culture, and artistic authenticity, the evening's formal entertainment program was announced by the gala's master of ceremonies, a distinguished gentleman whose voice carried the cultivated tones of someone educated at the finest institutions. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, creating an atmosphere of anticipation and reverence, as the first performers took their positions on the temporary stage that had been constructed at the eastern end of the magnificent space. The opening performance featured a classical Viennese waltz, executed by dancers from the Vienna State Opera Ballet, who had been flown in specifically for the occasion. The couple moved with the kind of mechanical perfection that Victoria and her circle had been trained to appreciate, every turn precisely calculated, every lift executed with textbook accuracy, every gesture controlled and predictable. The music, performed by a chamber orchestra comprised of musicians from the New York Philharmonic, the London Symphony, and the Vienna Philharmonic, was note-perfect and emotionally neutral, providing exactly the kind of refined background that enhanced rather than competed with sophisticated conversation. Victoria watched the performance with the practiced eye of someone who had been evaluating artistic expression for decades, noting the technical competence while simultaneously feeling a vague sense of dissatisfaction that she couldn't quite articulate. The dancers were undoubtedly skilled, their training was evident in every movement, their professionalism unquestionable, their commitment to classical technique admirable. Yet something essential seemed to be missing from their performance, some indefinable quality that would have transformed technical excellence into genuine artistry. As the evening progressed through its carefully programmed schedule of entertainment, Victoria found herself growing increasingly restless despite the undeniable quality of what she was witnessing. A string quartet from the Moscow Conservatory performed Brahms with flawless intonation and perfect ensemble work, but their interpretation felt safe and predictable. A soprano from La Scala sang arias from Puccini with technically perfect voice production, but her performance lacked the emotional vulnerability that made opera transcendent rather than merely impressive. The ballroom dancing performances continued with a foxtrot by champions from Blackpool, a rumba by title holders from the World Dance Championships, and a quick-step by dancers who had won every major competition in their field. Each performance demonstrated absolute mastery of technique, perfect partnership, and complete adherence to the classical forms that Victoria had spent her lifetime promoting and supporting. Yet she found herself feeling increasingly disconnected from what she was witnessing, as if she were observing museum exhibits rather than experiencing living art. During a brief intermission in the entertainment schedule, Victoria excused herself from her circle of companions and admirers, explaining that she needed to refresh her champagne and perhaps seek a few moments of solitude to process the evening's cultural offerings. She made her way toward the bar area, which had been established in a smaller adjacent room that offered magnificent views of Central Park, transformed into a winter wonderland by the gently falling snow. The bar itself was a work of art. Constructed from rare Brazilian rosewood and topped with a surface of hand-cut Italian marble that had been quarried specifically for the Plaza Hotel over a century ago. Crystal decanters containing cognacs and whiskies that cost thousands of dollars per bottle gleamed under soft lighting, while bartenders in pristine white jackets moved with the silent efficiency that the world's most expensive hotels demanded from their staff. The atmosphere was one of understated luxury, the kind of environment where the wealthy could retreat from the more public spaces to conduct private conversations or simply enjoy a moment of contemplation. As Victoria approached the bar to request a glass of the vintage Krug champagne that had been specially imported for the occasion, she noticed one of the evening's service staff standing nearby, apparently taking advantage of a brief lull in his duties to rest for a moment. He was young, probably in his mid-20s, with the kind of classical good looks that would have made him perfectly at home in a 1940s Hollywood film or Renaissance painting. His dark hair was impeccably styled, despite the demands of an evening spent serving demanding guests. His posture naturally elegant, even in the standard black and white uniform that all service personnel wore, and there was something about his overall bearing that suggested depths and complexities beneath the surface of his current circumstances. What immediately caught Victoria's attention about the young waiter was not his appearance, striking though it was, but rather the way he was listening to the music that filtered in from the main ballroom. While other staff members went about their duties with the professional detachment that expensive service required, he stood perfectly still, his eyes closed, his body swaying almost imperceptibly to the rhythm of the classical piece being performed on the distant stage. There was an intensity to his listening that suggested genuine musical understanding rather than mere background awareness, and Victoria found herself genuinely curious about this unexpected display of cultural sensitivity from someone she would normally have dismissed as simply part of the evening's hired help. His face, in repose as he listened to the music, revealed an intelligence and sensitivity that seemed incongruous with his current position. There was something almost aristocratic about his bone structure, a refinement in his features that suggested good breeding despite his obvious current circumstances. His hands, which Victoria noticed were long-fingered and graceful, moved slightly as if he were conducting an invisible orchestra or perhaps following choreography that existed only in his imagination. "Excuse me," Victoria said, approaching the young man with the mixture of curiosity and imperious confidence that had characterized her interactions with service staff for decades. "You seem to be quite absorbed in the musical performance." The waiter opened his eyes and turned toward her, and Victoria was immediately struck by the intelligence and warmth she saw reflected there. They were dark brown, almost black, and held depths that suggested experiences far beyond what his apparent age might indicate. When he smiled, which he did immediately upon seeing her, his entire face was transformed, revealing both natural charm and what appeared to be genuine pleasure at the opportunity for conversation. "Yes, Senora," he said, and Victoria immediately detected a slight accent that she couldn't immediately place, but which added an exotic quality to his already intriguing presence. "It is beautiful music, though I must confess that the interpretation strikes me as perhaps somewhat conservative for my personal taste." Victoria raised an eyebrow at this unexpected critical assessment from someone she had assumed would simply be grateful for exposure to classical music of any kind. The fact that he had opinions about musical interpretation and was articulate enough to express them diplomatically immediately elevated him in her estimation from simple service staff to someone potentially worthy of genuine conversation. "Conservative?" she asked, her tone reflecting both curiosity and slight challenge. "In what way do you find the performance lacking?" The waiter hesitated for just a moment, clearly aware that he was speaking to someone of obvious importance and influence, but seemingly unable to suppress his genuine feelings about what he was hearing. "The technical execution is absolutely flawless," he said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone accustomed to navigating potentially dangerous conversational territory. "The musicians are clearly masters of their instruments, and the dancers possess remarkable skill and training. But there seems to be something missing, some essential element that would transform competent performance into transcendent artistry." Victoria found herself genuinely intrigued by this unexpectedly sophisticated analysis from someone whose opinion she would normally never have solicited or considered. "And what essential element do you believe is missing from tonight's performances?" The young man's eyes lit up with genuine passion, and for a moment Victoria could see past his current circumstances to glimpse the person he might have been under different conditions. "Passion, Senora, risk-taking, emotional vulnerability, classical music and dance at their finest should transport both the performers and the audience to places that words cannot reach. They should make you feel something profound, should challenge your assumptions about yourself and the world around you. What I have observed this evening feels more like a museum exhibition than living, breathing, artistic expression." The observation was so perceptive and articulate that Victoria found herself genuinely impressed, rather than offended by his presumption in offering unsolicited criticism of carefully curated entertainment. "And I suppose you have extensive personal experience with classical music and dance that qualifies you to make such judgments." "Some experience, yes," the waiter replied, with the kind of modest confidence that suggested genuine accomplishment rather than false bravado. "I studied at the Conservatorio Nacional de Música in Buenos Aires for several years before circumstances brought me to New York. My specialization was in classical dance, particularly tango, but I also trained extensively in ballet, ballroom forms, and contemporary movement." Victoria's interest deepened significantly at this revelation. The Conservatorio Nacional in Buenos Aires was one of South America's most prestigious institutions for musical and dance education, known internationally for its rigorous training programs and the caliber of artists it produced. The fact that this young man had studied there suggested a level of talent and dedication that was completely at odds with his current position, serving drinks at society events. "What did you study specifically at the Conservatorio?" she asked, her tone now reflecting genuine curiosity rather than the polite condescension she typically showed towards service staff. "And what circumstances led you from Buenos Aires to this?" The waiter's expression grew slightly more guarded, as if he was uncertain how much personal information was appropriate to share with someone who was clearly a guest of enormous importance. "My name is Diego Miguel Morales," he said, offering the information as if it were a gift. "I studied classical and contemporary dance with an emphasis on Argentine tango, which requires not only technical precision, but also deep emotional understanding and cultural knowledge. I had hoped to pursue a professional performance career, but—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully before continuing. "Immigration complications, family financial emergencies, and the practical realities of pursuing an artistic career without family wealth to provide support made it necessary for me to find more immediately practical employment while I worked toward resolving my documentation issues and building the connections necessary to restart my artistic pursuits." Victoria found herself fascinated by this unexpected encounter with someone whose story contained elements of both privilege and hardship, artistic aspiration, and practical compromise. "Diego Miguel Morales," she repeated, testing the melodic quality of his name. "And you believe that tonight's performances, despite their obvious technical excellence, lack the emotional authenticity that you experienced in your training?" Diego's face brightened with the enthusiasm of someone who rarely had the opportunity to discuss subjects close to his heart with anyone who might understand their significance. "Exactly, Senora. Technical perfection is important. It provides the foundation upon which genuine artistry can be built. But technique without soul is merely athletic display. Anyone with sufficient training and practice can learn to execute movements correctly, but true dance requires opening your heart and allowing the music to move through you completely. As if fate itself had been listening to their conversation about authenticity and emotional depth in artistic expression, the orchestra in the main ballroom began to play the opening notes of La Comparsita, perhaps the most famous and emotionally complex tango composition ever written. Victoria recognized the piece immediately. It had been performed at society events for decades, usually as a showcase for technical virtuosity rather than genuine emotional expression. Diego's reaction to hearing those first haunting notes was immediate and unmistakable. His entire body seemed to come alive, his posture straightening, his eyes focusing with laser intensity as if he were preparing for battle or prayer. "Ah," he said softly, his voice carrying reverential appreciation. "Now here is music that deserves true justice." "Justice?" Victoria asked, intrigued by his choice of words and the obvious depth of his emotional response to the composition. "This piece," Diego explained, his voice taking on the tone of someone who understood music from both analytical and emotional perspectives, was composed by Gerardo Hernán Matos Rodriguez in 1916, when he was only 17 years old. It has been called the most famous tango in the world, and rightfully so, but most performers treat it as if it were merely a technical exercise or a showcase for their virtuosity. "Decide," he paused, listening intently to the interpretation being offered by the professional dancers on the distant stage, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he evaluated what he was hearing. In reality, La Comparsita is a profound meditation on loss, longing, and the bittersweet nature of memory. The title means "The Little Parade," and it tells the story of carnival revelers whose celebration has ended, leaving them to face the emptiness and melancholy that follows all temporary joys. It's about love that has been lost, dreams that have been deferred, and the courage required to continue dancing even when your heart is breaking. Victoria listened to Diego's passionate explanation while simultaneously observing the professional dancers on the distant stage through the archway that connected the bar area to the main ballroom. They moved with the same mechanical precision and emotional sterility that had characterized all evening's performances, hitting every choreographic mark and executing every technical element with textbook accuracy, but conveying none of the deeper meaning that Diego had just described with such eloquence and insight. "They are certainly skilled dancers," Victoria said diplomatically, though she was beginning to understand Diego's earlier criticisms of the evening's entertainment in a new light. "Skill without soul is exactly what I mean," Diego responded with quiet intensity that revealed the depth of his frustration with superficial artistic expression. Anyone can memorize choreography and practice until they can execute movements without error, but to truly dance tango, to honor what the music is trying to communicate, requires complete emotional vulnerability. You must be willing to expose your deepest feelings to your partner and to anyone who might be watching. He gestured toward the main ballroom, where the professional dancers were concluding their technically perfect but emotionally vacant interpretation of the masterpiece. "They are performing the steps, but they are not telling the story. They are demonstrating their training, but they are not sharing their souls." Victoria found herself looking at Diego with new appreciation and growing fascination. His insights into dance and musical interpretation were more sophisticated and emotionally intelligent than anything she typically heard from the supposed cultural experts in her own social circle. And there was an authenticity to his passion that was refreshing in a world where artistic opinions were often shaped more by social pressure and received wisdom than by genuine understanding or personal experience. "And I suppose," she said with a slight smile that contained elements of both challenge and genuine curiosity, You believe you could perform this piece with the kind of emotional authenticity and spiritual depth that you feel it truly deserves. Diego met her gaze directly, and for a moment Victoria saw not a waiter serving champagne at a society event, but an artist who had been forced by circumstances to suppress his true nature and calling. There was no boastfulness in his expression, no false bravado or inappropriate confidence, but there was something unmistakable that she could only describe as quiet certainty. "I know I could," he said simply, without arrogance, but with the kind of deep conviction that comes from years of training, natural talent, and genuine understanding. "Not because I am superior to those performers, who are clearly accomplished professionals, but because I have lived the emotions that this music expresses. I understand loss and longing and the courage required to continue hoping, even when hope seems foolish." Victoria felt a sudden surge of inspiration, the kind of impulsive idea that had made her legendary in social circles for her unpredictability, her flair for dramatic gestures, and her ability to create memorable moments that people would discuss for years afterward. She was genuinely bored by the evening's predictable entertainment, deeply intrigued by Diego's unexpected sophistication and passionate artistry, and increasingly curious to see whether his confidence was justified by actual ability. The combination of these factors, along with her natural inclination toward theatrical gestures and her position as someone who could afford to take social risks that others could not, crystallized into a decision that surprised even her with its boldness. "Well then," she said, raising her voice slightly so that several nearby guests could hear her clearly, "perhaps we should put your theory to the ultimate test." The guests who had overheard Victoria's comment, including a technology mogul, 2 ambassadors, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, turned toward her with immediate interest, recognizing the tone that usually preceded one of her famous social experiments or spontaneous cultural events. Within moments, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the magnetic combination of Victoria's commanding presence and their own curiosity about what she might be planning. "I'm sorry?" Diego said, clearly uncertain about what Victoria was proposing and possibly concerned about the attention she was drawing to their conversation. Victoria's smile grew wider as she recognized the potential for creating exactly the kind of unforgettable moment that would have the city's cultural circles talking for months and possibly years to come. Her reputation had been built partly on her ability to surprise and delight even the most jaded members of society, and she sensed that this unexpected encounter might provide the perfect opportunity for another legendary Victoria Ashworth Hamilton moment. "You have convinced me that classical dance should be passionate, risky, and emotionally authentic rather than merely technically correct," she announced, her voice carrying the authority that made people automatically stop whatever they were doing to listen when she spoke. "You believe that La Comparsita deserves to be performed with genuine feeling rather than mechanical precision. You claim that true artistry requires vulnerability and spiritual depth, not just choreographic competence." She paused dramatically, scanning the faces of the assembled guests and noting the mixture of curiosity, excitement, and slight apprehension that her words were generating among people who had thought they were attending a predictable charity gala. "Therefore, I am offering you the opportunity to prove your point in the most direct way possible, by demonstrating exactly what authentic artistic expression looks like." Diego's eyes widened as he began to understand the full implications of what Victoria was suggesting. "Senora, I am deeply honored by your interest, but I am working this evening and I am not dressed appropriately for—" "Nonsense!" Victoria interrupted with the imperious confidence that had bulldozed through social obstacles and conventional limitations for over 3 decades. "Anyone with eyes can see that you possess the natural bearing and physical presence of a trained performer, regardless of your current attire." And as for your work obligations, I believe I have sufficient influence with hotel management to arrange for a brief sabbatical from your serving duties." The crowd around them was growing larger as word spread throughout the ballroom that Victoria was orchestrating some kind of impromptu entertainment or social experiment. The professional dancers on the main stage had finished their performance of La Comparsita to the kind of polite applause that expensive events typically generated, and there was a natural lull in the evening's programming that created perfect timing for whatever Victoria had in mind. Several of Victoria's closest friends and most prominent social circle members had made their way over to investigate the commotion, including Jonathan Pemberton IV, Senator Morrison Chen, Maximilian von Habsburg-Lorraine, Dr. Wellington Smith, and Margaret Foxworth Pemberton. Their presence added weight and significance to whatever was about to unfold, as these individuals were collectively responsible for shaping opinion and setting trends throughout New York's cultural establishment. "But I would need a partner," Diego said, still trying to process the surreal turn the conversation had taken and the magnitude of what was being offered to him. "Tango is not a solo art form. It requires two people who can communicate completely through movement and touch." Victoria's smile became positively radiant with the kind of mischievous delight that her friends had learned to associate with her most memorable and audacious social coup. "I think that can be arranged as well, and quite easily." Jonathan Pemberton, who had been hovering nearby, hoping to ingratiate himself with Victoria and demonstrate his cultural sophistication, stepped forward eagerly with the enthusiasm of someone who rarely passed up opportunities to be the center of attention. "I would be delighted to volunteer, Victoria. I took extensive ballroom dancing lessons at the country club several years ago, and I've always considered myself quite accomplished at the classical forms." But Victoria shook her head definitively, her eyes still fixed on Diego, with the kind of calculating intensity that her business associates and social rivals had learned to both respect and fear. "No, Jonathan, though I appreciate your willingness to participate, I think this particular experiment requires someone with a bit more personal investment in the outcome." She turned to address the growing crowd of guests who had gathered around them, her voice carrying the natural authority that made people automatically stop whatever conversations they were having to listen when she spoke. The assembled group now included some of the most powerful and influential people in American society: senators, Supreme Court justices, tech billionaires, entertainment moguls, foreign dignitaries, and cultural luminaries who collectively shaped opinion and policy at the highest levels. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria announced, her voice pitched to carry clearly across the increasingly quiet space, "I have been engaged in a fascinating discussion with our young friend Diego here about the difference between technical competence and genuine artistic expression in classical dance." The ballroom fell almost completely silent, as Victoria's commanding presence and obvious preparation for a significant announcement drew everyone's attention. Even the waiters and other service staff stopped their activities, sensing that something unprecedented was about to occur. The professional entertainers on the main stage, having completed their scheduled performance, remained in place to observe whatever was about to unfold. "We have been treated this evening to technically proficient but, if I may be candid, somewhat emotionally sterile performances," Victoria continued, her words chosen carefully to critique without giving offense, while simultaneously setting up whatever revelation she had planned. "Our friend Diego has convinced me, through his insights and obvious passion, that true classical dance should be risky, vulnerable, and authentic, rather than merely correct and predictable." She paused for dramatic effect, a technique she had perfected over decades of commanding attention at social events, board meetings, and cultural gatherings. The silence in the ballroom was now complete, with several hundred of the world's most powerful people hanging on her every word. He has also convinced me that great music like La Comparsita deserves justice, performances that honor not just the technical requirements of the composition, but also the emotional depth and cultural significance that make it worthy of preservation and celebration. Victoria's gaze swept across the assembled crowd, noting the mixture of curiosity, excitement, and slight nervousness that her words were generating among people who had thought they were attending a predictable, charitable fundraising event. Therefore, I'm issuing a challenge that I believe will create an unforgettable demonstration of what authentic artistry looks like when it is unleashed from the constraints of convention and expectation. The anticipation in the room was now palpable, with guests leaning forward and whispering among themselves as they tried to guess what Victoria might be planning. Those who knew her well recognized the signs that she was about to create one of the legendary moments that would be discussed in social circles for years to come. If Diego can perform La Comparsita with the kind of passion, authenticity, and emotional vulnerability that he claims true tango requires, Victoria announced, her voice building toward what everyone sensed would be a dramatic climax, demonstrating that genuine artistry transcends social class, economic circumstances, and conventional expectations. Then I will personally ensure that he has every resource necessary to pursue his artistic dreams without the burden of financial desperation. The guests murmured excitedly among themselves, recognizing the magnitude of what Victoria was offering. Her philanthropic support had launched dozens of artistic careers over the years, and her backing would virtually guarantee Diego opportunities that most struggling artists could only dream of accessing. But, Victoria continued, raising her hand for silence as she prepared to deliver what everyone sensed would be the most surprising element of her challenge. The demonstration must be complete and authentic. To truly prove his point about genuine emotion and vulnerability in artistic expression, Diego cannot perform with a professional partner or someone from his own background and training. She paused, savoring the moment and the complete attention of everyone in the ballroom. He must dance with me. The announcement hit the assembled crowd like a thunderbolt, creating a buzz of excited conversation and surprised gasps throughout the ballroom. Victoria Ashworth Hamilton, Queen of New York society and one of the most powerful women in America, was challenging a young waiter to dance tango with her in front of hundreds of the world's most influential people. It was exactly the kind of bold, unexpected gesture that had made her legendary, but it was also potentially risky in ways that even she might not have fully considered. Diego stared at her in amazement, his mind clearly racing as he tried to process the enormity of what was being offered and what would be required of him. Dancing tango with a partner required not just technical skill, but also intimate connection, absolute trust, and the kind of physical and emotional communication that could be challenging even between people who knew each other well. "Senora," he said carefully, "I am deeply honored by your confidence and incredibly grateful for your generous offer. But tango is not simply a performance art. It requires genuine connection between partners, complete trust, and a level of intimacy that—" "Young man," Victoria interrupted with a laugh that carried genuine delight and anticipation, "I may be 54 years old and accustomed to formal ballroom etiquette, but I assure you that I am neither fragile nor afraid of emotional or physical challenge. If you can truly dance with the passion and authenticity you describe, then I am prepared to follow your lead wherever the music takes us, regardless of what that might require or what people might think." The challenge hung in the air between them, representing a moment of potential transformation for both participants. Diego looked around at the assembled crowd of Manhattan's most powerful and influential people, all waiting to see what he would do with this extraordinary opportunity that had materialized from what had begun as a casual conversation about music. The weight of the moment was evident in his expression, as he considered not just the immediate opportunity, but also the long-term implications of accepting or declining Victoria's offer. Success could launch his artistic career and provide him with resources he had never imagined having access to. Failure, however, could result in public humiliation in front of people whose opinions shaped cultural and social trends throughout American society. Finally, Diego straightened his shoulders and looked directly into Victoria's eyes, with the kind of confident intensity that she had not seen directed at her in years. There was something almost regal about his bearing as he made his decision, as if he were drawing on reserves of dignity and strength that his current circumstances had forced him to keep hidden. "Very well," he said simply, his voice carrying quiet determination and unmistakable resolve. "But if we are going to do this, we must do it completely and authentically. No compromises, no apologies, no holding back because of social conventions or concerns about propriety. Tango demands absolute honesty from both partners." Victoria felt a thrill of excitement and anticipation that she had not experienced in decades, the kind of exhilarating nervousness that came from stepping outside the carefully controlled boundaries of her normal existence. "I would not have it any other way." Diego nodded and turned toward the orchestra members, who were watching the proceedings with fascination and obvious eagerness to participate in whatever was about to unfold. "Could you please perform La Compasita once more?" he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. "But this time I ask you to play it as Matos Rodriguez intended, with all the pain, longing, passion, and bittersweet memory that the composition contains. Do not play it as background music or technical exercise, but as a prayer, a lament, a celebration of everything beautiful and tragic about human experience." The musicians, clearly energized by the unexpected turn the evening had taken and the opportunity to perform with genuine artistic freedom rather than providing polite entertainment, nodded enthusiastically. The lead violinist, a woman whose own artistic sensibilities had been somewhat constrained by the requirements of performing refined background music for social events, smiled with obvious pleasure at Diego's request. The concertmaster raised his violin and played a few experimental phrases, testing both the acoustics of the space and his own emotional connection to the music. The other orchestra members joined in, and even in those preliminary moments, everyone in the ballroom could hear the difference between what they were about to experience and the technically perfect but emotionally sterile performances that had characterized the evening's earlier entertainment. As the orchestra prepared to begin, Diego turned back to Victoria and extended his hand with a formal gallantry that would have been perfectly appropriate in any era or social context. Despite his waiter's uniform, he carried himself with the dignity of European nobility, and there was something in his manner that made Victoria feel as if she were being invited not just to dance, but to participate in something approaching sacred ceremony. "Señora Victoria," he said, using her name for the first time and investing it with a respect that transformed it from mere identification into something approaching an invocation. "Would you do me the extraordinary honor of this dance?" Victoria took his offered hand and felt an immediate shock of recognition, not personal recognition, but the recognition of meeting someone whose artistic passion and commitment matched the intensity of her own long-suppressed creative instincts. His hand was warm, strong, and graceful, with the calluses that came from years of serious physical training and the sensitivity that suggested someone accustomed to communicating through touch. "The honor is entirely mine, Diego," she replied, and meant it completely. The assembled crowd stepped back to create a clear space in the center of the ballroom, forming a natural circle around the unlikely pair. The professional dancers who had been performing earlier moved to join the audience, their own curiosity piqued by this unexpected challenge to their conventional approach to classical dance performance. Camera phones appeared throughout the crowd as guests recognized that they were about to witness something potentially historic. As the opening notes of La Comparsita filled the ballroom with their haunting beauty, Diego and Victoria stood facing each other in the traditional tango embrace. For a moment, neither moved, both listening intently to the music and feeling for the emotional undercurrent that would guide their interpretation of the piece. The music this time was completely different from the earlier performance. The orchestra played with genuine feeling, allowing the natural pathos and longing embedded in Matos Rodriguez's composition to emerge fully. The violins sang with voices that seemed to contain centuries of human experience, while the piano provided a rhythmic foundation that felt like a heartbeat, sometimes steady and strong, sometimes irregular with emotion. Then, Diego began to lead, and from the very first step, everyone in the ballroom understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This was not the mechanical precision that had characterized the evening's earlier performances, nor was it the tentative social dancing that usually occurred at charity galas when guests took to the floor. This was tango as it was meant to be experienced, raw, emotional, completely authentic in its expression of human longing, desire, loss, and hope. Diego moved with a fluidity and natural grace that made his inappropriate attire completely irrelevant, his body becoming a perfect instrument for expressing the music's emotional content. But more importantly, he led Victoria into movements and emotional territory that she had never accessed in decades of formal ballroom dancing lessons and social events. Under Diego's guidance, Victoria found herself expressing feelings and desires that had been buried beneath layers of social conditioning, proper behavior, and emotional restraint for most of her adult life. The tango embrace required complete trust and surrender to her partner's leadership, and she discovered that she was willing and able to follow him into artistic and emotional spaces that would have terrified her in any other context. The tango is fundamentally a conversation between two people conducted entirely through movement, touch, and shared response to music. It requires absolute vulnerability from both partners, complete presence in the moment, and willingness to communicate feelings that might be too intense or complex for words. As Diego and Victoria danced, their conversation became increasingly intimate and profound. Two souls connecting across barriers of age, social class, cultural background, and life experience. Victoria, who had spent her entire adult life maintaining perfect control over her emotions and public image, found herself surrendering to the music and to Diego's artistic vision in ways that were both terrifying and incredibly liberating. She moved with a sensuality and emotional abandon that would have been scandalous in any other context, but which felt completely natural and appropriate within the artistic framework that Diego had created. Diego, for his part, revealed himself to be not just technically accomplished, but genuinely gifted as both performer and teacher. He guided Victoria through increasingly complex movements and emotional territory with such sensitivity, intelligence, and care that she never felt uncertain or unsafe, despite being pushed far beyond anything she had ever attempted. His dancing told the story of his own journey, the dreams, disappointments, struggles, and persistent hope that had brought him from Buenos Aires to this unlikely moment of artistic triumph. As the music progressed through its various emotional movements, Diego led Victoria into sequences that were both technically challenging and emotionally devastating. They spun and paused and advanced and retreated in perfect synchronization, their bodies expressing the story of love discovered, celebrated, lost, and remembered that was embedded in every phrase of Matos Rodriguez's masterpiece. The assembled guests watched in stunned silence as the unlikely pair transformed the Plaza Hotel's ballroom into something approaching sacred space. This was not entertainment in any conventional sense. It was artistic communion, a demonstration of what became possible when technical skill served genuine emotion rather than replacing it, when social barriers were transcended by shared commitment to authentic expression. Victoria found herself accessing emotional depths and physical capabilities that she had never known she possessed. Under Diego's guidance, she executed complex movements that should have been beyond her training, following his lead through dramatic dips, intricate footwork patterns, and moments of suspended stillness that required perfect balance and complete trust. But more than the physical challenges, she found herself expressing emotions, desire, vulnerability, joy, sadness, hope, that she had spent decades learning to suppress or control. Diego, meanwhile, revealed layers of artistry and emotional intelligence that transformed him from an underemployed immigrant into a genuine master of his craft. His interpretation of the music was sophisticated and deeply personal, drawing on his own experiences of displacement, economic struggle, deferred dreams, and persistent faith in the possibility of artistic fulfillment. He danced not just with technical skill, but with his entire life story, sharing through movement what words could never adequately communicate. As the music approached its emotional climax, Diego led Victoria into the most challenging and intimate sequences of the dance. These were movements that required absolute trust between partners, perfect synchronization, and willingness to be completely vulnerable in front of hundreds of watching strangers. Victoria followed his lead without hesitation, her trust in his artistic vision overriding any concerns about propriety or social appropriateness. The climactic moments of their performance were breathtaking in their intensity and beauty. Diego lifted Victoria, spun her, supported her through dramatic poses that seemed to defy gravity and conventional expectations about what was possible between partners who had never danced together before. Victoria, meanwhile, demonstrated a grace and emotional courage that revealed depths of character and artistic sensitivity that even her closest friends had never suspected. When the music finally concluded with its characteristic combination of resolution and lingering sadness, Diego and Victoria stood frozen in the final pose for several long seconds, both breathing heavily from the physical and emotional intensity of what they had just shared. The ballroom was completely silent, as if the entire audience was afraid that speaking or moving would somehow diminish the power of what they had just witnessed. Victoria's usual composure was completely transformed. Her hair had come partially loose from its elaborate styling, her face was flushed with exertion and emotion, and her expression held a combination of exhilaration, surprise, and something approaching wonder. She looked like a woman who had just discovered something fundamental about herself that had been hidden beneath years of social conditioning and cultural expectations. Diego, meanwhile, stood with quiet dignity despite his inappropriate attire, his face showing the deep satisfaction of an artist who had successfully communicated his vision and shared something essential about the power of authentic expression. His eyes held gratitude, pride, and something that might have been amazement at what they had accomplished together. Then, slowly, the applause began. It started with Margaret Foxworth Pemberton, who had tears streaming down her cheeks and was applauding with the kind of genuine enthusiasm usually reserved for life-changing artistic experiences. The applause spread through the crowd until every person in the ballroom was clapping with real appreciation and emotional response. This was not the polite, measured applause that typically followed entertainment at society events. This was the kind of spontaneous, overwhelming response that genuine artistry provoked when it emerged unexpectedly and completely transformed everyone's understanding of what was possible. Victoria stepped back from Diego, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to process what had just occurred. "My God," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the continuing applause. "I had no idea. I never imagined that dance could be..." "That is what authentic tango feels like," Diego said gently, his own voice reflecting the emotional intensity of what they had shared. When technique serves emotion instead of replacing it, when partners trust each other completely, when the music is allowed to speak through the dancers instead of being merely illustrated by their movements. Victoria looked around at the assembled guests, all of whom were staring at her with expressions that ranged from admiration to amazement to something approaching awe. She realized that she had just done something completely unprecedented in her decades of social leadership. She had allowed herself to be genuinely vulnerable in public, to express authentic emotion without concern for how it might affect her carefully maintained image or social position. And rather than feeling embarrassed or exposed, she felt more alive and authentic than she had in years, possibly decades. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria announced, her voice carrying a new quality that her closest friends would later describe as joy mixed with discovery. "I believe we have just witnessed and participated in a demonstration of what genuine artistry looks like when it is liberated from the constraints of convention and expectation." She turned back to Diego, who was still standing in the center of the improvised dance floor, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just transpired and the response it had generated. "Diego Miguel Morales, you have not only met my challenge, you have exceeded it in ways that will change how I think about art, emotion, authenticity, and the courage required to create something genuinely meaningful." The crowd burst into renewed applause, recognizing not just the generosity of Victoria's acknowledgement, but the significance of what had occurred. Diego had not simply won a contest or demonstrated technical skill. He had transformed one of America's most powerful women into an advocate and collaborator, creating an artistic experience that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. "As promised," Victoria continued, "I will personally ensure that you have every resource necessary to pursue your artistic dreams without the burden of financial desperation. But more than that, I want to work with you to create opportunities for other artists who have been marginalized by economic circumstances, cultural barriers, or social prejudice." Over the following months, Victoria proved to be true to her word in ways that exceeded even Diego's most optimistic hopes. She established a comprehensive scholarship program for economically disadvantaged artists, not just providing financial support, but also creating mentorship opportunities, performance venues, and connections within the cultural establishment that could launch and sustain artistic careers. Diego became not just the beneficiary of Victoria's philanthropy, but her partner in reshaping how New York's cultural elite understood the relationship between economic privilege and artistic merit. His performances, supported by Victoria's connections and resources, drew audiences who came expecting to see exotic entertainment, but left having experienced something that fundamentally challenged their assumptions about class, culture, and the sources of genuine artistic expression. The scholarship program they developed together became a model that was eventually adopted by cultural institutions across the country, providing pathways for talented artists from disadvantaged backgrounds to access training, resources, and opportunities that had previously been available only to those born into wealth and privilege. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in Victoria herself. The woman who had spent decades maintaining perfect control over her emotions and public image, discovered that vulnerability and authenticity were not weaknesses to be hidden, but strengths to be celebrated and shared. Her dance with Diego had reminded her of creative dreams and artistic passions that she had buried beneath layers of social obligation, and had shown her that it was never too late to reconnect with aspects of herself that had been sacrificed to maintain her position in society. Victoria began taking regular tango lessons with Diego, not as charity or cultural education, but as genuine artistic exploration. She discovered that she had natural talent and deep emotional connection to the art form, and within a year, She was performing at cultural events and fundraisers, using her platform to demonstrate that artistic expression was not limited by age, social position, or previous experience. The relationship between Victoria and Diego evolved into one of the most interesting artistic partnerships in New York's cultural scene. Their performances together became legendary, not because of any romantic involvement. Their connection was purely artistic and intellectual, but because they demonstrated what became possible when technical skill, emotional authenticity, and genuine mutual respect combined to create something greater than either could achieve alone. Diego's career flourished beyond his most ambitious dreams. Within 2 years, he was performing with major dance companies, teaching masterclasses at prestigious institutions, and choreographing pieces that were performed by artists around the world. But he never forgot the evening when a chance conversation about musical interpretation led to the opportunity that transformed his life. Years later, when cultural journalists wrote about the transformation of New York's art scene and the emergence of more inclusive and authentic approaches to classical performance, they inevitably returned to that magical December evening at the Plaza Hotel, when an unexpected challenge led to a moment of genuine human connection that changed everything for everyone involved. The story became legendary not just in New York's social circles, but throughout the international cultural community, cited as an example of how art could transcend social barriers and create understanding between people who might otherwise never have recognized their common humanity. It demonstrated that talent, passion, and authenticity could emerge from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most valuable lessons came from those whom society was most inclined to overlook or dismiss. Victoria's original challenge, "If you dance to this song, I'll marry you," had been intended as a dramatic expression of her willingness to support Diego's artistic dreams. But in a deeper sense, she had married herself to a new understanding of what art could accomplish and what her own life could become when she had the courage to be vulnerable, authentic, and open to learning from people whose experiences differed dramatically from her own. The waiter who stunned the ballroom that December evening became a celebrated artist and teacher, but more importantly, he became a catalyst for change that rippled through cultural institutions and social structures for years to come. And the society matron who issued the challenge discovered that the most meaningful transformation was the one that began within herself, when she finally found the courage to dance as if her life depended on it, because, in the most important sense, it did.